talk a bit about its original owners and the couple that built it, and that would be Edgar Kaufman Jr. and his life partner, Paul Mayan, who was a Spanish architect. And this is Paul's work. He was a great industrial designer and an incredible architect, born in Spain back in the 19-teens, and made his way to New York to be educated. And he attended school at Cooper Union, where he learned about engineering and architecture. And his world collided with that of Edgar Kaufman Jr. in the 1950s, and they spent the remainder several decades of Edgar's life together when Edgar died in 1989 and Paul lived until the year 2000. But does anyone immediately know what the connection with Edgar Kaufman Jr. and architecture might happen to be? Anyone? I see you nodding. What is the connection?
Falling water.
Falling water. So, how many of you have had the pleasure of being able to visit Falling Water in Western Pennsylvania? Oh, so we have to get a bus next year. Next year we're getting on a bus. Hopefully we can do that then. And we're all going to Falling Water. I was very fortunate to grow up in Western Pennsylvania, and as Rich said, I was the director of the Andy Warhol Museum for many years in Pittsburgh. But growing up there, I had the really great luck of being able to go to Falling Water all the time, and through every season of the year. And it is, of course, one of the most well-known famous homes in the entire world. And it is, as we know, built out over a waterfall. And it was built for Edgar Jr.'s parents, Edgar and Lillian Kaufman, who happened to own the biggest department store chain in Pittsburgh. And that is how they built their fortune. And I grew up shopping at Kaufman's. It was decidedly part of life there. The main store in downtown Pittsburgh was incredibly chic. Remember, Pittsburgh used to be really, really wealthy back at the turn of the century. So there was a lot of money there and people needed to spend it. They actually had a vendome on the top floor that brought in haute couture from Paris, the best art collectibles. You could buy really anything there. So it was very chic, and the Kaufman's thus had really great taste and a really great aesthetic. And Edgar Jr., born in 1910, definitely followed in the family footsteps. He went off to Vienna right after graduating from high school, and he studied art and design in Vienna. He studied painting. After Vienna, he moved off to Florence, Italy, where he lived for 3 years. It was very good being the only child of a very wealthy family from Pittsburgh. So he took full advantage of the world as his oyster. He loved art, he loved architecture, and he spent those very formative years in Europe before coming back to the States. And he decided that he wanted to look more into architecture and industrial design. So, who would you go to work with at that very precise moment in time, in the late 1920s, early 1930s? He tracked down Frank Lloyd Wright. And he wrote Frank Lloyd Wright a letter, and he said, I would love to come and study with you at Taliesin East. This was before Taliesin West was a thing. So he went off to Frank Lloyd Wright's studio, and he worked with him and studied under him for 2 years. And he just became completely in love with the Frank Lloyd Wright aesthetic. And he cajoled his parents into commissioning Frank Lloyd Wright to build the house and to build Falling Water. So when he came back home to Pittsburgh, after, by the way, I should note that after doing all of this incredible work, studying art history, studying painting, studying design and architecture, his father said, and you're coming home and you're working for the business. So he went back home to Pittsburgh, got a job managing one of the departments of the department store, and of course, ostensibly he was going to take over the business, being the only child. But he realized that his parents loved design, so he could kind of have the best of both worlds and convince them to spend the money to commission and build Falling Water. And if you have time, I would highly recommend finding a book called Falling Water Rising which was written by my undergraduate professor, Frank Toker, who was one, he sadly passed 2 years ago, was one of the great architectural historians in Renaissance architecture from Italy, but he also had a very strong fixation and fascination with falling water. And it documents the entire process, the letters between the Kaufmans, between the parents, the son, Frank Lloyd Wright. And to say it was a contentious design process would be the understatement of the century. But I highly recommend that you find that book. It's a real page turner. And I love that this house is an offspring of falling water in a very specific way. Now obviously Paul, who designed this house, was an incredibly talented architect. And he, was obviously a frequent visitor to falling water. They kept the house in the family until 1963, when Edgar decided, after his parents died and were gone, he used it for many years, but he decided that it should be a museum and that the public should have access to it. So in 1963, he donates it to the Western Pennsylvania Conservancy, which is a nonprofit organization that to this day manages and operates falling water. When you go, and I really can't emphasize enough that you all need to make the trip, it's only about a 5.5 hour drive from the city, so it's not too horribly far, 6 hours or so from here. But you will see Paul's work there as well, because the Welcome Center, the visitor center, that you buy your tickets, that has the shop and the cafe, is a pavilion not dissimilar to this structure. It's circular. So there are circular pavilions. You come in, there's an art gallery that's about this size, about half of a circle. So you can see there's a relationship in his aesthetic, the way he's thinking about how he wants to live, how he wants to welcome people into falling water. And of course you then go through the Welcome Center and then go down the meandering paths and the trails through the woods and the mountain laurels and all of the beautiful Western Pennsylvania scenery, and you hear the house before you see it, as long as the waterfall is running at full tilt. And then all of a sudden it unfolds, and it's one of the most breathtaking buildings you will ever see. But there's one other very distinct reference to falling water here, and that is this great connecting walkway from the main house to the guest house. And this house here was designed later on as the guest house, and you can tell that Paul wanted to mimic falling water because it exactly mimics the outdoor covered walkway that connects the main falling water house to the guest house. So I love that he carried that through, brought it here, made it contemporary, made it different, but still also keeps the hints to Frank Lloyd Wright in these reds, which I would say is definitely a nod to Frank Lloyd Wright. But hopefully someone will find this house to be exactly what they're looking for, and just know that you can impress all of your friends and say that it has very direct ties